My name is Dr. Rico Francis. I'm from the Department of Fine Arts and Art History, talking to you today about Freud. And I hope to see many of you taking art history classes sometime soon. Okay, so let's begin. Everybody can hear me, right? Good, thanks. Okay. So ever used the word subconscious? The word subconscious. Welcome to Freud's world. I'm assuming all of you have used at some point the word subconscious. Welcome to Freud's world. Ever lost your keys and cannot find them? And then a few hours later they show up in exactly the place that you were looking for them, and you just cannot work out how you could have missed them in the first time around. Welcome to Freud's world. Welcome to psychoanalysis. Let me tell you a little anecdote, a little story. I had a friend when I was at university who was really sharp and smart. She always did very well, and we often studied for exams together. Then one day for an exam, she didn't show up. After the exam was over, I spoke to her and asked her what had happened. She was in a terrible state. She just did not understand how it could have happened, but she had set the alarm clock, and she realized afterwards that it was too late, and that she had set it, she realized afterwards, once it was already too late, that she had set the alarm clock for the wrong time. She set it for PM instead of AM. This was completely atypical of her. She was usually extremely responsible, fastidious, and careful. How could this have happened? Welcome to psychoanalysis. So Sigmund Freud, I've got the details over there and some pictures. Sigmund Freud is born in the Czech Republic in 1856, and he dies in London in 1938 at the age of 82. However, at a young age, he moves from the Czech Republic to Vienna and lives and works there all his life until he leaves Vienna, which is in Austria, for London, when he's fleeing the Nazis, the Nazi invasion. And that's in 1938, just a few years, a few months before his death. I'm afraid some people can't hear at the back, and I can't do anything about it. Okay, let's try this a little bit more. Is that better? Okay. So he really is a product of Vienna, which is very much a cultural hub at that time. He's trained as a medical doctor, specializing in neurology, but he very soon becomes interested in patients with psychological disturbances, and he spends the rest of his life working in that area. He develops the technique called psychoanalysis that we will be discussing today. So let's just talk about the term psychoanalysis. The first part, psycho, is a term that you should be familiar with, not least because you might use it as an insult against somebody, but really it's also because it's part of the word psychology, right? And it comes from the Greek word psyche, which generally just means mind, sometimes used brain, but generally functioning of the mind. Okay? And then analysis, so the psychoanalysis part of it, analysis is, you'll probably know that as understanding of, so generally you analyze something to understand it, right? But really what it means, also a Greek term, it comes from the idea of breaking down into component parts so as better to understand what is happening. So you analyze it into individual working parts, that's the analysis, to understand things better. So psychoanalysis is the attempt at understanding the human mind by understanding its component parts, its component elements. So just to summarize, give you some idea, have a look at this picture over here. This is a painting from 1959. And when you first look at it, so you can see, excuse me, whoops, hang on a sec. So you can see there's, so first of all, this massive big rock, right? Looks like a cliff face over here. And you can see this castle that's on top of it over there. And it's clear that the castle is made from the same material as the rock face. So the whole thing looks extremely stable, extremely solid. You couldn't imagine a more impregnable fortress. Everything looks as solid as you could possibly imagine. But really this is just a segment of the painting. And the whole painting looks like this. And in fact, the idea of this, what this painting is saying is, there's all of this, excuse me, sorry. There's all of this solidity that you see over here, but the whole thing is actually floating in the air. It should remind you of the expression castles in the air, right? So what you first thought was extremely solid and stable actually turns out to be extremely unstable. And this, in some ways, is a really good example of what psychoanalysis is about and what psychoanalysis discovers the mind to be about. So let me sum up using this, what I think is Freud's most important contribution to contemporary thought. You think you're in control, but you're not. Right? So the first painting is you think you're in control. The second part that you see, the full thing, is but you're not. But it's not that you're not in control because somebody else is in control. That sometimes happens too, but that's not what I'm talking about. You think you're in control of yourself, but you are not, because another part of you, one that you are not aware of, is instead in control of who you are. There's a hidden part of you that's responsible for pretty much all that you do and all that you think. And this is what Freud calls the unconscious. Okay, so this is the key term we're talking about today, the unconscious, which is usually abbreviated UCS. Okay, so the unconscious, most of what we do and think is actually the unconscious doing its thing. So Freud divides up the mind into two major parts, which is the conscious and the unconscious. By the way, funnily enough, Freud never uses the word subconscious. We use the term subconscious and we're thinking we're being very Freudian psychoanalytic, but Freud actually never uses that term. I'll talk more about that in just a second. So we've got these two parts. We've got the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. Conscious is usually abbreviated to CS. So you've got CS and UCS. So consciousness, let's just start with that, is the you who you think you are. Let me say that again. Consciousness is the you who you think you are. It's the you that's available to your awareness of yourself. You think about yourself, your character, your personality, your likes, your dislikes, your experiences, your ethics, your morality. All of that is your consciousness. Now, attached to the consciousness is the pre-conscious, right? Pre-conscious is something like what people talk about when they talk about the subconscious. It's like the reservoir from which consciousness draws for the most part. It deals with the things you've forgotten, but that you can remember with a little bit of effort. So if I say to you, what did you have for breakfast yesterday morning? You don't know immediately. You have to say, I think I had eggs, right? That's your pre-conscious at work. So it's there. You don't have immediate access to it, but you have to think about it, and you can kind of go in there and find that material. That's the pre-conscious. So with a little bit of memory jogging, you can get there. The unconscious, however, is radically different, both to the conscious and the pre-conscious. It consists of things you don't even know you think. And what's more, it's blocked to your own conscious thinking. You can't get to it just by thinking or by remembering. It's barred or it's hidden. And just think about how strange that is, what I've just said, right? So there are two parts of you. There's one part of you that's thinking, that you know. I mean, you think that thinking is conscious, right? But then it turns out that there's another part of you that's thinking, but you're not even aware that it's thinking. That's how strange this story is. So how does the unconscious happen? Where does it come from? Well, we aren't born with it. It comes into being as we develop as children. So in the first place, this is a story about growing up, and it thus starts with infancy. I want you to stop and think for a moment about what happens to kids as they get older, and how we as adults deal with them. On the one hand, when kids are very young, they're uncoordinated and they know nothing. And we're always saying to them, do this, don't do that, to teach them, to protect them. But think about this another way. One of the things we're doing as we say, do this, don't do that, is we're teaching them about becoming social human beings. We're teaching them to follow more and more the rules of society and of what we can and cannot do. And if you think about it as well, most of the time you pass with a very young is spent not really saying to them, do this. You spend much more of your time saying, don't do that. Kids seem to want to do lots of things that we as adults think they shouldn't be doing. But if you follow this through a little more, about this phenomenon of having to say no to kids all the times, we arrive at the strange proposition. In order to become a functioning human being, a social being, like the people we live amongst and see around us, we only get to be that by learning not to do. There are tons of things we do as kids that are entirely unacceptable, and we have to learn not to do them. So it's not just a question of learning to do things, but more a question of learning not to do things. But now here's the problem. We have these desires that are just not permissible in society. What do? You try to forget them. But think how long it takes to get kids to change, how often you have to say no for the same thing. Forgetting of desires is very difficult. In fact, says Freud, we never forget. We never stop in our desires. They never go away. They just persist. So what do you do as a subject? What do you do when faced with what you desire so strongly, which is also the thing that you're prohibited from indulging? Well, says Freud, because these things are forbidden, but equally because they don't go away, because you can't get rid of them, you suppress them. They're pushed underground, and you try your best not to be aware of them. In fact, you pretend to yourself, although let's be technical here, your conscious pretends, you're conscious because that's the you you're aware of, so your conscious pretends to itself that those things don't exist. The technical term for this is repression. We repress those forbidden, prohibited desires. This means that they effectively become split off from our conscious minds. And that thing that conscious excludes from itself, or consciousness excludes from itself, rejects from itself, and tries to forget, is the unconscious. Okay, so we were talking about conscious and unconscious. Now we know where the unconscious comes from. Unconscious is precisely because it's forbidden from entering consciousness. I can't emphasize enough how these things are radically separated from each other. So it's not just that you've got conscious and unconscious and they're kind of two separate rooms in a house, right? It's that they literally can't get together because what made the unconscious into the unconscious is that it's full of things that consciousness just cannot stand, cannot deal with. So it pushes them off into the separate section where it represses them and holds them away in this unconscious thing, unconscious area. Thus, the unconscious, containing all those desires, splits off and becomes its own entity with its own rules and modes of functioning, and those desires stay in there, bubbling away. They continue to affect us. They infiltrate our lives, push us in all sorts of strange directions, make us do all sorts of things that our conscious would never dream of, like the examples given above. They think of it as a suitcase into which you put all the things that are forbidden to you, all the thoughts, wishes, desires that you carry around with you. So you carry the suitcase around with you, except you don't know you're carrying it. You see only, as I was saying, you see only this part of the picture. You don't see that part of the picture. So now we have the mind divided into two main parts, conscious and unconscious. You could kind of say 2.5 parts because attached to the conscious is the preconscious that we were talking about, right? Now, the unconscious applies to memories as well. So it's not just thoughts and desires, it's memories as well. Now, some memories, as you know, as we said, you can recall, as we said for the preconscious. But some deep, deep memories relating to forbidden wishes and desires will become repressed and dispatched to the unconscious. To conscious, those repressed memories will appear to have been forgotten because they're not even preconscious anymore. But in reality, they will not be forgotten. They will not be erased, but simply partitioned off, like sent off to a dark room in a house whose existence you're not even aware of. Now, I'm going to talk for a moment about subjectivity. We mentioned this already in relation to consciousness. It concerns you as a subject. You think of yourself, you have an idea of who you are, of what makes you, you. You know who, now, think about it, you know who you are because you think of yourself. You're the subject of your own consciousness. But now here's the strange part. As far as you're concerned, when you think about yourself, you're one person. But from now on, with the unconscious, the subject is not one, but two. There is one you who's unconscious, and another you who's, there's one you who's conscious, and another you who is unconscious. So from now on, with the unconscious, the subject is not one, but two. Your conscious thinking is about you in one way. Your consciousness is thinking about you in one way, and your unconscious in another. Give you an example. You're walking along the street and you see something lying on the sidewalk. The kid in your unconscious says, as all kids do, something in front of me on the floor. Yum, let me put it in my mouth. Your conscious, which is the adult in you, is saying, yuck, that's disgusting. So here you are, the subject of two desires, and you don't know it or feel it because it's all unconscious. You are, on a very minor level in this example, a conflicted subject, torn between two desires, between two subject positions. Now you can see why these childish desires have to be repressed, right? No socialized, functioning adult in their right mind could possibly admit to themselves that they have a desire such as this. In fact, says psychoanalysis, your disgust is one of the mechanisms to help you keep your repressed desires at a distance, to disavow that desire. And let me just return to my initial examples, right? So my friend who was late for an exam. Now, one of the things that's happening there, right? So as far as she's concerned, she wants to show up for the exam. But apparently in her unconscious, there's something ticking along, and she's saying, I'm really scared to take this exam. Something in my sense of myself, maybe I'm not prepared, maybe they will realize that I'm a fraud and I'm not as smart as I say I am. So maybe it's easier just to skip that exam, right? So those are the two subjects at work. I'll give you another example. Lose your keys, right? This happens to everybody. Next time you lose your keys and you can't find them, ask yourself, what is it? What's the benefit to me of losing my keys? That means, can't go and have lunch at my grandmother's. Oops, can't go and meet somebody who I dislike, right? Now that will probably be repressed in the unconscious, but there's a function for it. So your unconscious is saying and your conscious is not very mature, right? It's the kid in you, it's immature. It's saying, just don't go, don't go. Nobody will notice, just don't go. Okay, and then how do I engineer not going? We'll lose the keys, right? So that's the way it operates. You've got your consciousness saying, where are the keys, where are the keys? You've got your unconscious saying, forget about the keys, lose them, lose them, lose them. And then, of course, once it's too late and once you've missed the appointment, then your unconscious is no longer functioning and then, they're right in front of you. They're in your pocket. They're in your bag, the very place that you looked for them all the time. That's the war between your conscious and your unconscious going on. Let me give you a diagram of this. So this is a schematic diagram. I'm gonna step out now. I'm gonna yell, so I hope you can hear me. So if you have a look at this, over here, this top level over here is your conscious. The bottom level over there is your unconscious. You can see over there. So on the conscious level, you've got the thoughts, your perceptions, unconscious, right? And stored knowledge, memories, things that you think of. I hope some of you can hear, but I'll come back. Sorry, I realized some of you were not hearing at the back. So on this top level over here, you can see that's your conscious. Bottom level, that's the unconscious over there. Thoughts, perceptions, some memories in relation to the preconscious, that's all the you who you're aware of. This over here is the unconscious. They're all those things that are too terrible for you to acknowledge in some ways. And so that's the section that's kind of, and it's often shown here, they call this the iceberg model, right? So it looks like the conscious is the bit of the iceberg that you're seeing on top, and then underneath is where all this other stuff is happening, which is your unconscious. Now, let me give you some broad repercussions of this. I want to come to the main theme of your reading for today, which is civilization and its discontents. Now, civilization, that's the thing we think of as being the greatest achievement of humanity. Civilization relates to our social being, to our construction of society, and our living together in community. Before Freud, people just asked, how can we make society better? People thought we could just get better at doing it, and that there was nothing really standing in the way of constructing an ever better society. And that even more than that, the better the society, the happier we will be as humans. But Freud says, no, that's not how it works. He says our human nature, because of our unconscious, is fundamentally opposed to civilization. Freud is the first person to look at society and say it's something that, weirdly enough, doesn't really suit us as humans. Society gives us all sorts of benefits, but also it hurts us. To become civilized, we pay a huge price. We sacrifice a very large part of who we are, and that sacrifice really is very painful. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We repress our desires. We cannot indulge them, and so we are discontent. That's the discontent of civilization and its discontents. For most social theorists who are not Freudians, the question is, how can we construct a society that allows us to be happy? Freud says, no matter what you do with society, we will always be unhappy because the simple fact of being in society already prevents us from reaching happiness by forcing us to repress our desires. So now think of this again, just to come back to of the things that we want to do. Just think of the violence of children. Think how violent school playgrounds often are. Now, obviously, such a thing is impossible. You can't have that kind of violence within society, within civilization. Civilization has to banish that kind of thing because it constitutes disintegrator forces of society. Such things have to be banned, but being desires, they don't go away. They go into unconscious where they're repressed. And those desires always remain unhappy because they cannot be fulfilled. Now, you can see that according to Freud, the mind is not just a big machine churning out ideas. It's very carefully organized into a series of compartments. And there is one more we have to talk about. The you of conscious is also called the ego, right? That's another technical term. You'll sometimes say the term. You probably insulted each other by saying, you're such an egomaniac, you're so egocentric, right? And now, ego is another, it's a Greek word it's another word for I. So it's just me, I, right? But there's one more thing called the superego, which again, I assume most of you have heard of. And let's go back to kids, where we're always saying no, no, no. But at a certain point, as they grow up, you don't have to say no so much anymore. They have learned the lessons you have been trying to teach them. And one of the words we use today, you can kind of say they've become self-policing, right? They have learned to say no to themselves. And that's because they have internalized the voice of authority saying no. You don't have to say it anymore because you are now inside their head saying no to them. They hear an authority voice saying no, but it's coming from inside. They've sectioned off another part of their mind that is now fully occupied by what was once an external voice, but is now an internal voice. This is the superego, right? So super just means above, right? So you've got the ego, and the superego is this other voice that sits on top of the ego, and is saying to it most of the time, it's saying, no, you can't do that. So it's a little bit like a policeman looking down on you saying no all the time. Now this is important because when you say no to yourself, it is you saying no, but also it's not you, right? It's a part of you, but it's a part of you that has been colonized or taken over by an outside authority voice. So you can see the two yous in action again, right? Whenever Freud writes, it's never just one person. There always is like we had the conscious and the unconscious. Now you've got the you and the not you. That's all still somehow part of you in terms of the ego and the superego. And I'll show you another slightly more complex diagram over here. And so this over here, that's the ego. Just think of that as another way of saying, kind of, it's associated with the unconscious. This over here is the unconscious. Now this diagram is not as simple as the previous one, right? The split between the unconscious and the conscious is over here, okay? So they've drawn it like this. So consciousness, that's the part of you you know of. This is the preconscious, that's the part of you that's kind of there, but you can forget but remember. And then there's that part over there with everything below over here, which is the unconscious, stuff that you don't know and stuff that you can't remember. But then interestingly enough, along this line over here is the superego. So that's the part that's always working either against the ego or even against the unconscious over here. It's working on both a conscious and an unconscious level. That's the superego. So now the superego on the one hand is a good thing. It's responsible for all your good behavior in society and that you're here today more or less behaving yourselves. But it can also cause all sorts of problems, most distinctive of which is guilt, right? Feeling guilty. I feel so guilty, I lied to my parents. I told them I was going to study with a friend, but really I went clubbing and I had a wild night out on the town. On the one hand, your parents will be upset, but worse than your parents being upset with you is the fact that you are upset with yourself. That corrosion of your soul, the way the thought comes back to you and eats you up inside, that's your superego biting into your ego. It's your idea of your parents, right? That's the superego. It's not your parents, it's your idea of your parents. Often the idea is worse than the reality. So guilt leads to severe psychological problems, to paralysis, to depression, to distress. So again, just to break off, so here we are, again, this notion of the mind always in conflict with itself. Now, so far I've given you examples drawn from everyday life of the repressed not going away, of the things that we all do. But what Freud is famous for is treating disturbed people, and specifically neurotics. And in relation to mentally disturbed people, Freud discovers that many illnesses are caused by the return of the repressed, right? So we're talking about things that are repressed. When the repressed comes back, that's when you find all kinds of problems. I'll give you an example. Say you hate potatoes. Makes no sense. Everyone loves potatoes. And it gets worse and worse, and you become ill and you gag and you throw up at the thought of them. And you're obsessed. Every time you go out for a meal, you think, what if there are potatoes in there? And eventually it becomes so bad that you're scared to leave the house, and it really ruins your life. So you got to go to a psychoanalyst and you talk about it. And slowly, slowly, you discover a memory. Another child at school, someone who was a bully, who persecuted you, who really made you suffer. And this guy was always eating chips. And every time he approached you, you could smell those chips and knew what was coming. But after a time had passed, and you grew up, and you lost your awareness of the whole nasty, horrible story. And you thought you forgot about the events. But in reality, you repressed them because they were too painful for you to bear, and because you hated to think of yourself as a coward and a victim. And then years later, you suddenly find that you cannot bear potatoes or chips, and the fear takes over your life, and you have no idea why. This is the return of the repressed. Ideas sit in that dark suitcase and haunt you, and you're aware of the haunting. You're aware of the effect, but you have no idea where it comes from, because it comes from a part of you of which you are literally unconscious. So Freud develops a therapy about bringing things to consciousness. He believes that you can unlock those problems, and the theory is that if you can bring those repressed thoughts out of that dark suitcase and think them through, you will hopefully get better. Once you really relive them, think about them, face them, instead of repressing them, you draw that ferocious energy out of them, and they stop haunting you to the same degree. Make the unconscious conscious, and the dark power fades away. But now to talk about the unconscious a little bit more, which is where this is all happening. So the unconscious is not just conscious but right? It has a very different mode of operation. So let's think about this. Consciousness is characterized by reason. It's where reasoning and logic happens. It's our way of thinking. Why are you late? There was traffic jam. Why are you wearing a jacket? I was cold. The unconscious, however, operates in a completely different way. There is no reason or logic. Why are you late? The answer could be because the trees are green. There is no time in the unconscious. There are no opposites in the unconscious. A is bigger than B also means that B is bigger than A. Now, we have terms for the way in which these different mind functions operate. So to start with that, the conscious mind working rationally, rational logical thought we called secondary process. Now that should surprise you. You might have thought that if I'm calling that secondary process, maybe we should have called that primary process. But it's the other way around. Primary process is the irrational, illogical way in which the unconscious works. So you can tell from calling primary and secondary, you can imagine that in the primary process is much more of the way we think than secondary process. So just again, secondary process is logical, primary process is illogical. Now, I'm going to show you a diagram that we're going to spend a bit of time on. Have a look at this over here, all right? And have a look at this think about this chain of words. So let's start from the word chair. And then chair, your next thought might be table, right? Chair and table often go together. And then imagine table and stable. That kind of works. And then you go from stable to strong. That kind of works as well. You can understand that connection. And then stable to horse. That makes sense. Horse, car. You can go shopping, right? You can follow this chain. It kind of makes sense as you follow it through. And then there's another line over there. Table, leg, right? Tables have legs. Leg can be broken, and the opposite of broken would be perfect. All right? Now, this is an example of primary process. And the funny thing about it is there are connections between them, and each connection is, you don't really want to call it logical. It kind of makes sense, but it's not really the laws of logic or rationality, right? But the interesting thing about it is just have a look at how different the modes of association are. So chair and table, because on this planet we often have chairs and tables together, right? But then the word table, right, you could also think, well, tables are stable things, right? So they kind of go together. But also, they kind of rhyme. The able, table, stable, there's a kind of rhyming connection between them, right? And then once you've got stable over here, well, then stable has got two different meanings, right? Stable can be strong, or stable can be associated with a horse, right? So can you see that they're kind of all related, but they're not related in any single way. This is kind of random series of associations. And then, of course, from a horse, well, horses move around. A horse, old-fashioned car is the modern version. From the car, you can get to the shops. And then once we've got table over here, so we split over here, right? You can go table to stable in one direction, but you can also get table to have legs. So chair, table, leg. That kind of association works. But then if you've got a leg, well, legs can be broken. I remember when my leg was broken. I mean, that's not true, but you could imagine saying that. And then from broken, the opposite would be perfect. So this whole chain of this whole network of terms and phrases that are all related, one in some way or another, but in this kind of random way to each other. All right? This is primary process, and this is the way your unconscious works. Now, something else that's strange about this is, in your unconscious, each one of these things is equivalent from a kind of emotional point of view, if I can put it that way. You'll see what I mean in just a second. And this really gives you some strange results. Say you have something in your unconscious that it really wants to express, that it's really obsessed by. Let's go back to that guy who tortured you at school, and you really hate him and want to break his neck. Your unconscious can represent breaking his neck over here by any one of these ideas along the chain. So in your unconscious, the concept and the idea and the value of breaking the neck can be represented by any one of these things along the chain. Maybe you keep thinking of a chair, right? Thinking about broken. Maybe you keep thinking of a chair. Or maybe you keep thinking of a perfect round circle. Any or all of these could represent the fundamental wish of breaking that guy's neck. And in fact, this example as I first gave it to you was a little unrealistic. It's unlikely that you would hate potatoes because that's too direct, that's too kind of rational, right? You might have a terrible obsession with vinegar or with ketchup. Something further along the chain of associations, or something like crinkly packets. Like every time you might hear crinkly packets, like chip packets, it might drive you crazy. Now, how does this come out? It comes out in behavior, as we saw with examples above. In fact, many neurotic symptoms are the acting out of these wishes. In our example above of the guy who tortured you, you're always, say, breaking chairs, right? Because that's the one way it goes. You're always breaking chairs. Or, for example, you're terrified of horses. All of those things in your unconscious could mean the same thing, could be related to that same initial story of somebody who tortured you, and your wish to get your vengeance and do some damage to him. By the way, see what I mean by repressed wishes being incompatible with society and civilization. Your innermost wish is to be violent, but for a reason you don't even remember. Civilization can't deal with that. But there are other ways in which these wishes come out. One of them is free association. Now, free association is something like I've just done here, right? When I sat down and I kind of just let my mind wander. It's the kind of thing you might find in a daydream, right? When you're kind of not quite awake, not quite asleep, and suddenly your mind is kind of moving along and these weird, strange pictures are popping up, strange thoughts are popping up. That's something like a kind of free association chain. But another one of the major ways that Freud talks about is dreams. Some of you, I don't know whether you know of this, but Freud is famous for a book called Interpretation of Dreams. So when you're asleep, when all your defenses and the distractions of reality are down, that's when your unconscious roams free. These strange images that pop up, the strange images that you see in your dream, that's the chain of associations rolling along. And remember what I was saying, this is the way your unconscious is working all the time. Right now, you're listening to me, hopefully your rational mind is paying attention. There's another huge part of your brain that's ticking away with a strange set of associations. Don't tell me, I don't want to know. We'll talk about those in a second. So now talk about those wishes coming out, right? Talking about those repressed wishes coming out. Remember that most of the things that are in your unconscious are only there because they're too unacceptable, too repulsive even, to be accepted by the conscious. And that means that when the unconscious wants to express itself, as it does in a dream, conscious will not allow those wishes to appear in the form that it finds repulsive. So the unconscious finds a way to get around the conscious prohibition, and it does this through a system of disguise. It's like sneaking into a party from which you have been forbidden. You get past the guards by disguising yourself. And one of the words we use for that is censorship, right? So you can only get from conscious, I won't show you the diagram, you can only get from conscious into unconscious into consciousness by a system of disguise. You can't go straight through. So again, the only conditions under which the unconscious passes into consciousness is through a disguise. And this chain of association provides the means of disguise. So this chain of associations provides the means of disguise. Break his neck, too violent for your sense of self. Think of a chair. Now this keeps all the parts almost happy. To the unconscious, each of these is the same, right? as we were saying. So to the unconscious, each of those is the same. So neck and chair have the same value. But to consciousness, neck is impossible, but chair is okay. So it comes through as a chair. So the dream that you remember, because now think about this, what you remember is conscious, right? So the dream that you remember is what remains of a wish or a desire or a memory once it has passed through disguise. So wishes start off, hang on a sec, let's go back. So wishes start off over here in the unconscious, but by the time they get up out of there, around that barrier over there, by the time they get up around over there, they're in disguise, and they bear almost no relation to what the initial wish was. So as I say, it's only through a disguise. So it's like going to a costume ball, a dress-up party, or a disguise party, where all you see are strange costumes and masks. This is one of the reasons dreams are so weird, right? What you remember when you remember a dream, it's kind of strange and weird, and none of it really makes sense. That's because what you're looking at is the strange costumes and masks. This is, as I say, one of the reasons the dreams are so weird. It's the disguise pushing things around so that your conscious doesn't recognize them. People love to record their dreams, to tell others about them, but all they're doing is looking at the surface disguise. The true content is lurking below the surface, evading your prying eyes. It's like trying to catch a thief and all you grab is their jacket. Your recollection of your dreams is mostly a collection of jackets that you've pulled off the backs of the thieves. The thieves always escape. But the guards at the door aren't perfect. The disguise is often not perfect, and you can sometimes work out what's underneath it. One of the things the unconscious likes to do with these elements is to blend things together, often in images. It was the shop assistant I saw in the store yesterday. So in my dream, I think it was the shop assistant I saw in the store yesterday, but weird. She looked like my sister in the dream. And wait, now that I think about it, she looked even more like my mother. All kind of condensed together, right? And often in that process of condensation, you can find the truth of what your unconscious is getting at. Who exactly? It looked most like the shop assistant, but really the dream was about my mother. So now, I want to come on to content. You may notice that so far I've been talking about a map of the mind and also about the mechanisms of how it all works together, how it all fits together. But I haven't said much about the content, the subject matter of what goes into the unconscious. But in fact, Freud gets into a lot of detail about content. Not just that desires in general get repressed. Specific desires get repressed or come to take on more importance. And here we're talking about sex. When Freud analyzes his patients, there is one topic above all others that he finds there, and that's sex. Let me tell you another story. It comes to us from ancient Greece. There's a man called Oedipus. I'll show you the spelling of this in a second. Oedipus is a man from the Greek city of Corinth, and he goes traveling. He gets into a fight at a crossroads, and he kills somebody. Later, he arrives in the city of Thebes, which is ruled over by a queen. There, he performs a heroic deed that the people of the city much appreciate. He's proclaimed king in gratitude, and he marries the queen of the city, and has 2 daughters by her. Several years later, through a strange sequence of events, he discovers that he had in fact been born in the city of Thebes. In fact, he was the son of the king, but had been given away for adoption at an early age to the town of Corinth, where he had grown up. Now, you may think this is something of a happy fairy tale, not so. He's born the son of the king, and through a series of accidents of fate, he returns to the place of his birth, although he didn't know it, to take his place on the throne. But no, that's not how it turns out. The story takes a dreadful turn. It further emerges that the man he had killed at the crossroads was his own father, and that the woman he has married, the queen, and by whom he has had children, is his own mother. This is the myth of Oedipus, and it's a famous play by Sophocles. Called Oedipus the King, Oedipus Rex, by Sophocles, the Greek playwright, from around 430 BC, from ancient Greece. Now, Freud says it's not just a great play and a myth, but it's a great play because it tells the truth of our own secret desires. Up to now, I've spoken about the unconscious as being the place where our repressed memories and desires end up. For Freud, the most important repressed desire in the unconscious is the one where boys wish to murder their fathers and marry their mothers, and for girls, murder their mothers and marry their fathers. This is probably the most controversial point of Freud's whole work. It's called the Oedipus complex, and you should know about it because it figures largely in popular culture and cultural history. Now, whether you believe the specific details of it or not, of wanting to murder and then marry, the crucial point concerns the notion of sex being at the core of our unconscious, and it's one of the key ideas of psychoanalysis. And I say this partly in jest. Before you scoff too loudly, ask yourself if your boyfriend or girlfriend doesn't have lots in common with one of your parents. And look around and see how many people have partners that look like their parent of the opposite sex. And if you think about it, it makes sense. When you're young, who are you closest to? Who touches your body? Who caresses you? Who holds you? Who gives you the most love? To the infant, these are intensely pleasurable, yet they have to be renounced as you get older. But those desires, as we saw, don't ever go away. They get pushed into the unconscious, where they stay as desires, seeking satisfaction. Now again, whether you believe in Oedipus or not, the idea of sex in the unconscious is central. Freud gives an example of a woman several times a day, ordinary middle-class woman, who several times a day runs into a room, upsets a glass of water on the tablecloth, and calls for the maid. It's totally bizarre. I'll tell you again. So there's a woman, several times a day, she runs into the main room, throws a glass of water on the tablecloth, and calls for the maid. Totally bizarre, as I say. No one knows what it's about, but it is ruining everybody's life. On analysis, the following story emerges. The woman marries a man much older than her who could not consummate the marriage. The woman is very embarrassed, and she hopes the maid will not notice the next morning, so she throws red ink on the sheets. Years later, she has forgotten the episode, but has developed this strange episode. She's forgotten the whole episode, but has developed a strange symptom. See how many strands are woven together here. The sex, the return of the repressed. Her wish is to prove that her husband is not impotent, and repeats that action to show the maid her proof. But see the primary process in action, right, through the chain of association. The maid, any maid, right? So first she wants to show the maid, but then in later years it just becomes any maid, right? Blood, red ink, or water, right? See the association along the primary process chain again, and see the disguise. To the maid, indeed to anyone, it's all meaningless. It doesn't, even to the person herself, it doesn't actually mean anything. It only means something in the unconscious. But neurotically, in her unconscious, that same story is being repeated. I have to prove that my husband is not impotent, and so here's the story. Here are the components of the story passed through disguise. So to end, to return to civilization and discontents, we spoke earlier about our inner wishes, not just violence, but most importantly, sex, which has to be controlled by society. Now, we saw that civilization forces us to repress our instincts and our desires, and so we are unhappy. But we've also seen that repression does not work 100%, because the repressed always returns, and when it returns, when repression is undone, it threatens to tear society apart. No one is ever happy in this story. As humans, we're unsatisfied because we're suppressed, but civilization and society is always under attack by failed repression. Society is always in a fragile state, just about to collapse. It's all a very unstable balance. Now, let me just finish with 2 quick points. Controversies and revolutions. I'll just say one little thing about a revolution, one of the reasons why Freud is revolutionary, from the point of view of kind of psychic health or mental health. Before Freud, mad was just mad. Mad people were unreachable. Freud was the first to listen to mad people and to think that underneath their craziness, so to speak, there was some internal logic, even if it didn't make sense within normal standards of reason. Now, now to come mainly to the controversies, come back to sex. Now, if you mention Freud in popular culture, most people will think of the sex angle. And without a doubt, this is one of his major revolutions. It's highly controversial, but simultaneously most influential. And however much you may knock him and criticize him, I'm afraid he's already won. How so? This idea of sex at the core of the unconscious also means that sex is at the core of who we are. But if this was a revolutionary idea in 1900 Vienna, Hasn't it become true now? We in our modern times don't stop talking about sex. It's with us all the time. It's so prevalent in our popular culture, from advertising to the way we dress. Look at the way you're dressed compared to the way these people here are dressed. To music videos. And I was thinking about this, about Hannah Montana, Miley Cyrus. Have you seen any videos by Miley Cyrus? Talk about sex. Nicki Minaj. Think about those kinds of images that are just with us all the time. It's a kind of overtly sexual content. Now, this all in some ways goes back to Freud. I'm not saying he caused it, but he opened the subject and began thinking about it very early. This idea of humans as inherently sexual, that sex is at our center, is also an idea that is accepted by most people in Western society, for sure. Before Freud, sex was never at the center of the universe. Think of how people dressed, as I say, and how they behaved. Sex was something never spoken about, never really acknowledged. This is one of Freud's major revolutions. He really changed the way we think of ourselves. But personally, I think the greatest revolution is not sex, but the notion of the unconscious. The idea that a part of us is not only beyond our control, but beyond our knowing. That we are not in control of ourselves. That we are strangers to ourselves. That we are not one subject, but two. These ideas are profoundly destabilizing. This goes against everything that we think we are. Our whole civilization is built on it. This idea that ultimately we are sovereign individuals in control of ourselves, doing what we want. Not so, says Freud. In this respect, Freud is often paired with Darwin. Darwin shocked everyone by overturning the idea that we, as humans, are a special creation of God. People were amazed at the idea that we are just like animals, related to monkeys and chimpanzees. Freud takes this debunking of our elevated idea of ourselves even further. We are not even in control of ourselves. We are not even masters in our own homes. And his idea of civilization and its discontents is still something that we struggle with every day. Ultimately, says Freud, the part of us that most strongly wants to do what it wants to do cannot because of civilization. And the part of us that actually can do what it wants is really making do with second best. Thank you.